Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for players and guides for Dungeon Masters.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Before we get into this week's topic, we just wanted to let you know that this episode of our show has been sponsored by our very own Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign, which is now live on Kickstarter.
This is a complete adventure for characters level 1 to 13 set in a ruined dark fantasy city, devastated by a cosmic cataclysm.
In this campaign, your player characters will embark on their own personal quest into the ruins of a dark fantasy city. We have created dungeons that include the ruins of Baroque cathedrals, ancient castles, mutated gardens, deadly craters filled with eldritch radiation, and much, much more.
As your characters venture into the ruins of Drakkenheim, they will find themselves caught in the web of political intrigue between 5 rival factions who are struggling to decide what is to be done with Drakkenheim.
In addition to a dynamic sandbox adventure, we have also designed brand new spells, magic items, and horrific monsters inspired by our favorite elements of cosmic horror and dark fantasy.
This campaign is live now on Kickstarter, and we have been blown away by the support that we have already seen. We not only hit our goal in less than 5 minutes, but we also have blown past so many of our stretch goals, which has allowed Monty and I to create more content to put into this book. We're so thankful for the community and the outpouring of love and kindness that we have heard with the campaign setting that we've created.
We have partnered with a fantastic team at Ghostfire Gaming to bring this project to life, and we are so excited to be able to be creating a book that is just filled with incredible artwork and gorgeous maps.
So follow the links below to join in on the Kickstarter today, or go to Drakkenheim.com to see what all of this hype is about.
So this week's topic has actually been inspired by several conversations that have been happening in the comments on many of our recent videos, as we've been talking about the wizard subclasses that were revisited in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, particularly the Bladsinger wizard. And the question came up from several of our commenters of how does the Bladsinger wizard compare against the other classes and subclasses that can fulfill the archetype that has been colloquially known as the Gish. And ultimately the question that we're looking at today is, what's the best Gish in D&D 5e?
What was really interesting is when we were looking at the wizard subclasses as a whole, we didn't give the Bladesinger the S tier. We gave it an A tier because we think that wizard is just a really strong subclass. But then Monty and I started to have these discussions on an A tier wizard still might be an S tier in the grand scheme of Dungeons & Dragons for the spell and sword playstyle that the Gish presents.
For those of you feeling a little bit lost and wondering, what is a Gish and why are we using this term? Perhaps a very brief history lesson to introduce exactly what we mean when we talk about a Gish. In 1981, the Fiend Folio introduced the Githyanki and the Githzerai. People who inhabit the astral planes in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons and who have been fragmented and warring against mind flayers and red dragons and with each other since time immemorial. Within the Githyanki people, a particular tradition emerged of warriors who combined swordplay with magic, often known for wielding spells such as Fireball, Counterspell, Haste, as they used magical silver swords to combat mind flayers while riding red dragons. Sounds pretty metal, and it is a really awesome archetype. I believe the Fiend Folio actually called the original Githyanki Gish a magic user and a fighter. You had to have equal multi-classing between those two things.
Since then, the idea of a Gish has expanded beyond that of just the Githyanki ideals. We now look at other ideas such as a spell sword or a sword mage, as they are commonly called. But Gish is a term now used to kind of all-encompass this idea of mixing swordplay and sorcery together in one great class or subclass in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons.
It's also often very much associated with many elven traditions, because often there is this idea of the elven warrior wielding a very fine longsword while still slinging spells around. So it has this really great basis in a lot of classic fantasy literature, a lot of fantasy imagery around elves and Githyanki and all these sort of, magical warriors. And, even Gandalf used a sword. And I think for players that have really enjoyed video games like the Elder Scrolls series or even the Witcher games, where Combining swordplay and magic kind of works very seamlessly in tandem with the single player character. I think it's a very attractive archetype and one that is really fun because you kind of get to play all the bases.
The spell sword is really exciting for a lot of fantasy fans out there because spellcasting is one of those elements that really heightens the fantastical, imaginative worlds that we play in. But the swordplay and the fighter archetype is a really iconic build as well. So to combine those two together just feels right in a fantasy setting. And luckily, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has introduced a lot of magic to some of the melee classes and a lot of melee components to the magical classes, allowing a lot of different ways that you can play into this sword and spell archetype.
Especially compared to prior editions of D&D, where trying to build a character that could do both of these things effectively was really, really hard, and oftentimes you ended up with a character that could do both poorly and not really do anything well. Whereas in 5th edition, I think we are spoiled for choice with so many different options that allow you to play a character that can fight and cast spells at the same time. So for us, when we are looking at what do we think of as a Gish in the context of D&D 5e, I think for me it boils down to three things. You get the extra attack class feature and proficiency in some kind of martial weapon. You can cast spells, and ideally all the way up to 9th level spells. And I don't know about you, but I think that the Gish really feels like an arcane sort of character. So I want to have blasty spells, or the spells that we normally think of as being arcane in nature.
Yeah, I do agree with those. Now, we're going to list our nominees for the Gish class. Some of these do not fall into those categories, so we may not talk about them as in depth. But I do want to give a lot of honorable mentions to some of the characters and classes that you could play to really bring the sword and spell playstyle to life.
So if we're thinking about all the classes that we could play in this archetype, obviously we're starting off with the Bladsinger Wizard being a pretty front contender here, but I think that there's a lot of other potentials. What would some of them include?
Prior to the introduction of the Bladesinger, we had some of the core classes that did mix swordplay and sorcery. Mainly the Eldritch Knight was a great contender, where you were a fighter who got to add in some limited spell casting. But still, they got some pretty blasty spells, the ability to cast Shield or Firebolt, and the options to pair that with your attacks is really potent and pretty awesome.
I know we disparage these subclasses in our Bard tier class ranking, but I actually do think that if we're looking at the context of what is the best Gish, I think we have to put the Swords Bard, the Valor Bard, and possibly even the Whispers Bard on the table. Because if we're looking at this, these are all archetypes that fill our criteria. We got arcane spellcasting up to 9th level spells. You can pick up a fireball with magical secrets if you want to, and many of these archetypes get extra attack or things that augment your melee attacks. So if you want to play that type of character, I think the Bard is a really serious contender.
Now, there is an argument out there that pretty much all paladins do mix this swordplay and sorcery spell type, although I do think that they lean more into the swordplay with a bit of divine casting, but they do really bring to life this idea. On top of that, clerics already kind of lean into this. They are great and potent spellcasters, and especially if you're doing something like the Forge, Tempest, or War Domain, you're really leaning into that battlefield spell and sword combo. Now, these are more divine casters, and I think they already presented the options that fill their specific niche. So I don't know if I would consider them Gish characters, but there is an argument out there.
Yeah, there's something to be said for the divine Gish, which feels like a different archetype to me. Because I think whenever I have a player that would come to me saying, I want to have magic and swords, I wouldn't necessarily point them towards the cleric, because I feel like there's something about the cleric or the paladin that is specifically with that divine flavor runs counter to what is so often in people's heads. This is also why another character that really in many respects plays like a Gish is a Moon Druid. But again, I think it really defies the archetype and starts to stretch the bounds of like what people think of as a Gish. So while strictly speaking on paper, you're like, yeah, it's casting spells. Yes, it's making attacks. Yes, it's doing cool things with magic. I feel like the Moon Druid kind of is just out of bounds a little bit.
I agree. Several of the Artificer archetypes also kind of play around with combining spellcasting and combat. But again, I think with this, we're dealing with a half caster, and I think that mechanical sort of building element doesn't really lend itself to the Gish. The Artificer kind of feels like its own thing.
Yeah, and I would say a similar thing about the Arcane Trickster as well. Like, it feels like a magical assassin. And in the lore, the Githyanki Gishes were assassins, but I think the Arcane Trickster, again, is putting a very different spin that I feel like the Clerics, the Artificers, and the Arcane Tricksters are kind of in their own categories. That, yes, there's definitely the Venn diagram shows the overlap clearly, but I'm not sure it fits the right thing.
The other contender here that is one of the prominent options is the introduction of the Hexblade Warlock.
Yeah.
The Hexblade Warlock really, really speaks to the Gish playstyle. Before the Bladesinger was revised in Tasha's, I think the Hexblade Warlock was the front-running Gish playstyle and has some really potent options baked into the class. Now, with the revisions on the Bladesinger, we now have the question on our hands, which is why we're making this video on who is the better Gish.
If we're going top three, I really think the Bards deserve a place on the podium.
I can agree with that. At first, this felt like it might have been Hexblade versus Bladesinger, but despite the fact that we kind of didn't love the Swords Bard in the Bard tier ranking, again, moving it into the Gish tier ranking, I think the Swords Bard is actually a really potent and really strong choice. I do like the Whispers Bard and the Valor Bard as well, but I think out of the three, the best battle and spell playstyle is going to be found in the Swords Bard.
I think that all three of these bards really feel like a different kind of Gish than what we imagine as the traditional Gish. Because they're going to have a much bigger focus, I think, on buffing their party members, on casting enchantment and illusion spells, or again, augmenting their own martial abilities, than they necessarily will with a Gish, who in many cases is a flat-out damage dealer or a battlefield controller or just a spell slinger while they're going in with their swords. I think the Bard plays really differently compared to the Bladesinger and the Hexblade.
I think, personally, this might be a strange comparison, but for me, when I think of the Bard at its core, it feels like the spellcasting cousin to the Rogue.
Yeah.
Where it's leaning more into trickery and charm and illusion. It's using its wits and cunning with its spellcasting to kind of be that witty player on the battlefield. And I think that does feel a little different than the Gish, although I do still think that the Bard does deserve a place on the podium.
Yeah. And I would love to see the Elder's Knight on the podium, but I think the Elder's Knight kind of falls into the same category as the Paladin. It doesn't get full spellcasting, but it uses its spells in a really amazing way to augment what it's doing with melee combat. Like, just seeing how Jill plays her Eldritch Knight in our campaigns, she's done some clutch things with her spells, but most oftentimes the Eldritch Knight is, occasionally throwing some ranged attacks, but it's all about shield.
Yeah, really the Eldritch Knight is just a fighter who can cast shield and has some tricks up their sleeves for clutch moments. But that's a really cool play style. But I think it falls under the Swords Bard, the Hexblade, and the Bladesinger.
One of the things that we talked about a lot in the Bladesinger video that I think really defines the Gish playstyle is that you got to be able to turn on a dime. You got to be able to evaluate the situation and say, you know what? I know I could stab this person with my sword, but I could end this fight faster by casting Banishment or Wall of Force or Hypnotic Pattern, or I need to be casting a Fireball now. I think the strength of the Gish is this powerhouse level of adaptability. It's the ability to not just have one defining strategy, but to turn on a dime and say, you know what, I need to get to the front line now, or you know what, I'm going to go back and I'm going to be a utility caster for the time being.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the contention now really comes down to the Bladesinger or the Hexblade.
And this is where the debate comes in. I think if we're looking at our podium, Swords Bard, congratulations, you've got the bronze medal, you are third place. Now the question becomes, who's first place out of the Bladesinger or the Hexblade Warlock? Both have a lot of pros and a few cons. And they kind of fill two different play styles that are similar, but open up very different options. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of what these offer as a Gish playstyle.
So for the Bladesinger, I think the biggest pro is you are a wizard.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are still a wizard at the end of the day, which means that you get the plethora of options for spells that wizards have. There's no class in the game that has as many spells on their spell list as the wizard, and you can change them all out with your spell book. You got lots of spell slots going on to power everything that you want to do, and especially when you were comparing to the Hexblade, it's a big advantage.
Yeah, so when we look at the wizard's spell list, not only do you get some of the most game-breaking, earth-shattering, and world-changing spells at higher levels, the wizard spell list is just unquestionably the best spell list, I think, in the game.
Yeah.
Now, not only that, but if you look through their spell list, some of the spells that aren't as often used by wizards, that really actually complement a melee playstyle, are also mixed in there. So by being a wizard, you get this really great diversity in your spell choices that allow you to switch on that dime between either really excelling using your spells and swords in melee combat, or switching to be like, you know what, I'm going to change the world with my spell casting. And that is a really big pro for the Bladesinger wizard.
I also think the Bladesinger wizard has such a cool change from Tasha's, where unlike everyone else in the game, the Bladesinger's extra attack lets them combine it with cantrips like Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade. Yeah. A lot of people don't realize this, so if you're wondering, you can't combine extra attack with cantrips. The Bladesinger can, and this was something that was changed in Tasha's color and everything. And that alone is super cool, because it means that even when you are fighting, you are magic. Yeah. And that's really great.
One of the other great features of the Bladesinger is their ability to boost their AC when they go into Bladesong, and they have some other abilities that really allow them to be a powerhouse on the front lines and really, really hard to hit. Not to mention, like the Eldritch Knight, you have access to shield. So when you're on the front lines, having shield can change the battle. You're really, really hard to hit. Yep. And that's going to be very important when we look at the cons of the Bladesinger as well.
But Bladesingers can really easily pump their AC into the high 20s and even as high as like 30 or more. To get it over 30, you're going to have some really generous magic items. So I think DMs, like, one of the biggest recipes for disaster you could ever do as a dungeon master is giving your Bladesinger a cloak of displacement.
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
I would even be a little wary giving my Bladesinger like a ring or cloak of protection.
Yeah,
I feel like it's too much.
It does. It's as soon as magic items get into the mix, the Bladesinger just kind of whoa. But there are some downsides here. We talked about this in our Bladesinger build guide, but the hardest thing with the Bladesinger is that you don't get an ability like the Hexblade does that lets you use your spellcasting ability for attacking. You still are reliant on either strength or dexterity, and with the limited weapon selection of the Bladesinger, you have to go down a finesse weapon route. Like, you can't even be clever about it and try to use like a quarterstaff or try to use... You can't flat out use any of the two-handed weapons. There's a clever way to use a hand crossbow with this, but it really cuts you off from doing anything like Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter or Polearm Master or any of those other traditional melee damage dealing things. Fortunately, your spells make up for that, but man, the Bladesinger would be crazy if you could use a greatsword.
Yeah. And on top of that, one other thing to consider about the Bladesinger is that it still uses a d6 hit die. It is one of the squishier characters. Now, although boosting your AC into the stratosphere means that you're going to be really hard to hit, there may be occasions where you can't enter Bladesong, or you get stuck with an enemy that has a plus 12 or plus 14 to hit and still nails that damage on you, in which case you still might go down.
Yeah, it's really brutal as a Bladesinger to end up in a situation where you have to make like a constitution saving throw against a bucket of damage that isn't like a damage type that you can throw up absorb elements to protect yourself from. Those things do exist and they will hit you really hard, and because you have to manage between your dexterity, your intelligence, and your constitution score, it's really hard to have all those things firing at once. If you roll crazy with your ability scores, you're going to be fine, but a lot of people are using point by now, so it is a thing to factor in.
Now, as we move into the Hexblade, we have a few different pros and cons to look at here. One of my best pros for the Hexblade Warlock is that they do get to use their charisma as for their attacks and damage rolls, and this is huge. This means that you can completely ignore your other ability scores. You can pump everything into charisma and constitution, which is going to make you a little bit beefier and a little bit easier to manage when you're building the character.
The other thing is, as a Hexblade Warlock, you've got proficiency in shields, you've got proficiency in medium armor, and you get a martial weapon proficiency across the board, and your weapon choice is unshackled, because as a Hexblade, if you take your pact weapon and make that your hex weapon, that can be anything. So normally there's a whole bunch of restrictions that prevent a Hexblade from choosing a halberd or a greatsword or a longbow as their hex weapon, but if it's their pact weapon, they get around that, and you can even play a hex bow by using the right invocation. So there's actually a lot of adaptability, and this also means that the Hexblade Warlock can now build a character that uses things like Great Weapon Master and uses things like Polearm Master or Sharpshooter if you wanted to, or also you can pack along Sentinel. Like, you have a lot of different build options with feats, I think, here that you might not consider as a Bladesinger.
Yeah, and that really does mean that we've talked about these feats several times. We're pretty notorious for mentioning them.
Yeah.
But they do open up a really potent melee playstyle or ranged playstyle. So being aware of that on the Hexblade is really important. And on top of that, you do have the D8 hit die, which your AC may never be as high as a Bladesinger can go, but you will be able to take more hits and keep going.
I also think the Hexblade just has some cooler features in the form of, like, getting to summon the Spectre, or having the Armor of Hex's ability, having all the interesting invocations. They can do things like having Darkness and Devil's Sight, which can grant them, round-the-clock advantage. And so they've got a pretty deep bag of tricks in their backcourt. And I do think that the result is pretty potent. And the fact that it is a charisma package means that you could also be the face of the party. Like, there's a lot of roles that you can fulfill here too. It's really cool.
Now, of course, you are a warlock, so you're going to have access to the cantrip Eldritch Blast, which means that you always have a reliable fallback if you can't get into melee combat. So a warlock with Eldritch Blast is really great. A warlock with Eldritch Blast who can then jump into melee combat and destroy people is even better. I also think more so than the Bladesinger, the Hexblade Warlock is open to some really incredible multi-classing potential. Specifically, multi-classing with a Paladin or a Sorcerer becomes a really, really great option that might actually rival the Bladesinger.
I've seen also some good suggestions for multi-classing with Bards too for this. It's not that the Bladesinger can't multi-class. There's some really interesting ideas with multi-classing a Bladesinger with Fighter or even Artificer. I do think that the multi-class combos with the Hexblade are better.
When we talk about the cons of the Hexblade, one interesting thing came up in the discussion between Monty and I, and that is, at its core, we think that the Wizard is just a stronger class as a spellcaster than the Warlock is. It was a really interesting thing that we kind of discovered while discussing this, but you have extremely limited spell slots. So even at your best, the Hexblade Warlock is going to rely on their melee damage and what they do in melee combat more than being a potent spellcaster. You have some clutch spells that you can pull out at key moments to really devastate your enemies, but you're really only going to get 2 to 3 of those before you have to take a rest to get them back.
The limitations of the Warlock spellcasting are something that I see time and time and time again, especially in Tier 2 play, where you only have 2 Warlock spell slots. It feels like you just burn through those instantaneously, and if you don't get the opportunity to take a short rest to get those back, which many times you do, but often I find, at least in my experience, player characters have to go through at least 2 combat encounters before they get an opportunity to take a rest. And when things are strung together really, really quickly, I just see the Warlock run out of gas. really fast.
Now, luckily, as a Hexblade, you do have great melee potential, and you still have your invocations and things like that. But if we're talking about the Gish playstyle, this is a detriment that, yeah, you run out of magical gas pretty quick and have to just turn into a sort of arcane fighter rather than a Bladesinger who is going to be able to whip out spells as they need to whenever the opportunity arises.
But it doesn't change the fact that, like, with a Hexblade Warlock, your capacity to use a spell like Shield or Counterspell is much more reduced compared to the Wizard, where the Wizard's just going to burn a first level spell slot on Shield and they don't care because that's what they're there for.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas with a Warlock, casting Shield once is half your spell slots. So it's a much bigger kind of ask in the immediate term. I also think that the Bladesinger, again, is spoiled for choice because the Hexblade has Hex, which is cool. They have Spirit Shroud, which is also great. They do have Shadowblade, but the problem is that Shadowblade can't work with the Hex Weapon or Pact Weapon features. They don't have animate objects. They don't have haste. Yeah. So there's a lot of amazing gishy spells that you would love to have as a Hexblade Warlock. You just don't get them.
But as a Hexblade Warlock, you still are dishing out a ton of damage. And with certain build options, you can really, really bring the hurt to almost any combat encounter repeatedly.
I think with the damage dealing, though, we should measure our expectations here. Because both the Bladesinger and the Hexblade Warlock are capable of impressive and in some cases oppressive levels of damage. I think as a dungeon master, if you have either of these characters at your table, you are going to have to be thinking about encounter balance in a different way because both of them have the capability to just one-shot a foe of equal challenge rating to them. I think they can both pull it off. And so it's that point of like, if we can say, oh yeah, well, the Bladesinger can do 150 damage a round, but the Hexblade Warlock can only do 120, doesn't really matter when the enemy only had 80 hit points.
Yeah. And also another thing that I'm thinking about right now is that the Hexblade can run out of gas as a spellcaster, but the Bladesinger can run out of Bladesong uses.
They can, but that being tied to their proficiency modifier, I think makes that less of an issue.
Because it does scale better with their leveling up.
Right, because you're starting off with 2 uses of that ability right off the bat, which means that you're covered for 2 combat encounters. And then you're covered for 3. And the thing is that even if you don't have Bladesong up, you're still a wizard.
Yeah. So when we look at these 2 subclasses, I think really when we're trying to decide who's first and who's second, I think everybody out there should note that whatever one of these you want to play, you are going to be one of the coolest characters on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And I think even the Swords Bard, who's standing there in 3rd place waiting for us to make this decision with her bronze medal, is still going to have a really great time mixing that sword and sorcery playstyle. And I think all 3 of these are just great options for that fantasy.
Yeah.
But I don't know. This is the tough part because also when we're trying to compare these, I think the Hexblade Warlock from earlier levels to kind of tier 2-ish, yeah, they have lower spell slots, but at tier 2 play, I think the Hexblade Warlock comes out on top. But then you get high-level wizard spellcasting.
I feel like as soon as the Bladesinger Wizard starts getting spells like Contingency and Force Cage, it's kind of, oh man, like they kind of get ahead and the gap never closes. I actually think that there might be a contention to say that past level 12, even the Swords Bard might be a stronger character overall than the Hexblade Warlock. But I think the comparison here is like Olympic gold medalists who you need a high-speed camera to figure out who crossed the finish line first.
Yeah.
I think in ranking these 3 characters and these 3 archetypes, I think it's really important to say that any of them at the table are going to be game warping and all of them are worth playing. And I actually, if I was sitting down today to play a campaign and you told me you could pick one of these 3 to play, I would have a really hard choice because I think it really, because I think the power level of these are so high that it really does come down to style.
Yeah, and I do think that is the case here, is that there's very different elements that shine in all three of these subclass class options. The Bard, the Warlock, and the Wizard are three of our favorite classes in the game. And the Hexblade Warlock is definitely my favorite Warlock option, and actually got me really excited for the idea of playing a Warlock. I love the Hexblade. It is kind of my first choice for playing. But when it comes to the podium, it might be my silver medal.
I'm inclined to agree. I think the Bladsinger does come up on top. I think they'll, overall, looking at all three of these, I think even a year ago, I think I would have said the Hexblade Warlock is the way to go.
Yeah.
But I think a lot has changed in the game with Tasha's Cauldron. I think a lot has changed about the way the game plays, and definitely played a lot more D&D, and we've seen a lot of these classes at the table and seeing them. And I think that all of them would be immensely satisfying to play. And I think that I'm just so impressed with how much more I like the Bladesinger and how much more I like the Swords Bard. Yeah, is the Swords Bard going to come in like a Hexblade Warlock as a total gangbuster damage dealer? I don't think so. I think the Swords Bard definitely takes a lot more work to bring it to the damage dealing capabilities of the Wizard and the Hexblade. Although the Bard does get animate objects, and animate objects punches real hard. But yeah, it's close. But I think Bladesinger, Hexblade, Bard.
So if you're excited for playing a Gish in Dungeons & Dragons, not only are these three options really great, but as we said near the beginning, there are so many cool ways to bring sword and sorcery into play at the table. You might really find you enjoy playing a paladin, a cleric, a moon druid, or many of the other options that we detailed. Eldritch Knights are phenomenal. Arcane Tricksters get to mix that sneak with that sorcery as well. So there's a lot of cool ways to add that little bit of magic into your playstyle that are really potent. But when we talk about the Gish playstyle, these three really, really stand out. And even though we're trying to rank them, really, they're all winners in our books, and we can hand out these medals all day to these wonderful, wonderful subclasses that really speak to one of the greatest playstyles for fantasy role-playing in general.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is probably the most fun archetype for D&D 5e. It feels like you get to play the most elements of the game.
So this has been a look at who is the best Gish in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about your thoughts on the best Gish characters in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting our work by following the links in the description below.
And don't forget to check out our live play Shadows of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we have plenty more class guides for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.